Hello, everyone, and welcome to the 51st episode of TechLifeSkills with Tanmay. Thank you very much for joining me today. My name is Tanmay Bakshi, and this morning I am very excited to get to talk to two very talented students, and I am particularly excited because they work on technology that I am personally very interested in. For example, you may know that on previous episodes, and really generally, I've talked a lot about, for example, humanoid robots, and how in a lot of the cases, while the technology itself is great, a lot of people apply it in the wrong way as effectively glorified chatbots. But one of our special guests, Karen, is actually working on making that technology meaningful, actually working on social robotics and different human-robot interaction technology. And we are also being joined by Minarose, working on some really fascinating computational neuroscience research that leverages deep learning technology so we can better understand the brain. This is really fascinating stuff, and they're already working on cutting-edge technology, so I can't wait to hear their advice for all the students out there and where they think this technology is going in the future. And so, without any further ado, I'd now love to welcome Karen and Minarose to the show. Hi, Karen. Hi, Minarose. How are you?
Hi, Tanmay. Thanks for having us.
Of course.
Hello, it's a pleasure.
Hello, glad to have you both on the show. I'm really excited to get to hear your thoughts on the world of tech finally. As a matter of fact, actually, to begin, I'd love to, hear from the two of you a little bit more about what you do, how you actually got here. Maybe just quickly introduce yourselves. Mina Rose, let's go ahead and start off with you. Do you want to tell everybody a little bit more about who you are?
Yeah, for sure. So I'm a third year student studying neuroscience at McMaster University, and I am also doing research with machine learning, specifically deep learning, building a convolutional neural network using an autoencoder to reconstruct neuroimaging data. And before that, I got to also work with neuroinformatics, also with neuroimaging, trying to find correlations between the neuroimaging data and behavioral performance on cognitive tasks. And my background in computational neuroscience started after first year when I took a course and I learned Python. And then after that, I've been learning as I go along with experience in research.
Very nice. I mean, that's the best way to learn in my experience is always from, well, experience, right? It's always to actually get some really be able to work in the real world. I think that's the best way to really figure out how to work on something best. But yeah, no, thank you for sharing. And Karen, I'd love to hear from you as well. Maybe tell everybody a bit more about who you are.
Thank you. So my name is Karen. I'm a robotics researcher and engineer at SoftBank Robotics based in Europe. I'm also a third-year PhD candidate at Sorbonne University, so on robotics and artificial intelligence. A bit about me. So actually my background, my undergrad studies, I did it in physics. After that, I did my master's in mechanical engineering. So my background in robotics was more from control, mechatronics, kinematics. But then I worked on several internships. So I built mobile robots. I got the chance to build even hand robots that were linked to EEG signals. And then from there, I was more interested in moving towards software and moving more towards machine learning because through my internships, I got to work more on neural nets, LSTMs, and I thought, okay, I'm more interested in that. So I knew I wanted to continue in research. I love research, but at the same time, I wanted to be in the industry. And I got lucky because here in Europe, it's easier for you to be full-time based in a company, but still do your PhD. And I got to do that through a type of scholarship or funding in Europe that's called, it's funded directly by the European Commission. It's called Marie Curie projects. And mine is called Animatas. So I'm based full-time at SoftBank Robotics, but I also am completing my PhD. Hopefully this will be my hopefully I'll be defending by the end of the year. And my work focus is on synthesizing multimodal social intelligence for robots. So when robots are placed, interacting with humans, what does it mean to be socially intelligent? How should you behave? And we're talking about more about understanding, okay, if I have several humans around me, is a group being formed? What does that mean? How should the robot behave? Understanding what does it mean to use the multimodalities of robots. So we're talking about gestures, social navigation, gaze, but also emotional expressions. And I also work on reinforcement learning to kind of use the human's input as a feedback for the robot, and accordingly have the robot learn and adapt to interactions. So this is a bit about me in a nutshell.
Wow, thank you very much for sharing. I mean, that's so much fascinating stuff. Actually ties quite well back into what Minarose works on as well. I mean, as you mentioned with EEG, actually, and in particular, reinforcement learning really fascinates me because a little while ago, at least I'd say a couple months ago, I used to be of the opinion of there's no real world application of reinforcement learning yet, right? It's like everybody using it for all these different toy tasks, like playing games or OpenAI. I believe had this thing where they used reinforcement learning to train like a hand to solve a Rubik's cube and stuff in the real world. But there wasn't anything real being done with it. And a little while ago, when OpenAI released their new little toolkit for fine-tuning language models with reinforcement learning, so that you could get language models to produce a certain kind of text. Like, for example, you could use BERT to guide GPT to generate positive text, right? That just blew my mind, and I was like, reinforcement learning is amazing. So I can't wait to dive deeper into that, actually. As a matter of fact, we're already getting a couple questions from the audience, including a question from Aratrika Day asking, what are the key implications during the development of a social robot? This might be a little bit sort of further ahead in the conversation, but actually, you know what? I'd love to go ahead and start taking that up now. Asking, once again, what are the key implications during the development of a social robot? So what are your thoughts, Karen? I know we haven't delved too deep into this yet, so maybe there's not that much background, but are there any initial thoughts you'd like to share?
The question is quite broad because social robots are also you're dealing with a lot of things. I like to think of the work that's being done in social robots is quite interdisciplinary and multidisciplinary. Really, you will find a lot of people even from psychology backgrounds working in the field, or even linguistics, because the way I see it in social robotics, you kind of have these three, if you want, bubbles under which the research roles. You have people who work more on the perception and knowledge side, because you have people from computer vision, natural language processing that try to understand and process or perceive information, and then based on the information create semantics or knowledge around it and taxonomies to kind of understand what does that mean. You have other people that work more on the behavior. So if we're talking about socially aware navigation, or as I said, certain gestures, or just the behavior itself, what does it mean? So we're talking even about arm movement, all that falls into that, because there's a lot of kinematics control in there. But then you have also people who work more on the decision making process, which is kind of towards the end. So okay, let's assume I have my knowledge and I know how to behave. How should I do it? And here, there are people who work on different methods. So, in the field, you will find that a lot of people, some still try to dive into more rule-based algorithms, because to kind of have a better understanding of how to implement it. Others have worked on supervised, unsupervised learning. So, and then the field is still like growing, and a lot of people are trying to dive into that. But I would say it's really a sequence of all these three, and you will find a bit of research in any of those layers if you want.
Right. I kind of want to dive a little bit deeper into that, and this is something that I think maybe the both of you could sort of expand upon with your experience, where this sort of opens up the whole question of not just, the field of social robots, but then also sort of ties a little bit into, actually quite a bit into the world of like artificial intelligence and machine learning, and how do you get them to be, what we call socially intelligent almost, right? And the reason that is personally such a difficult thing to sort of grasp as to how you would do that, concretely, is because so many of the things that we do as humans aren't even, necessarily separable from the way that we are social, right? So I mean, if you take a look, there's this wonderful Vsauce video called "The Science of Awkwardness," where they talk about how, for example, and this is just a very, very small example, how humans have this sort of complex, behavior or feeling where we can feel awkward, right? And that's because we have this sort of innate bias towards not wanting to be socially outcast, right? We want to be socially accepted because then you're more likely to survive, because you're more likely to be with more humans, right? So we have all these different behavioral, patterns that are just tied to the way that we are socially innately, right? And so that also ties into, can we actually build robots that are social, right, in a sense, without needing to have full on like, general artificial intelligence capability and things like this, which is a question that of course we can't definitively answer today, but is there any sort of research that you could point to, or really anything from your experience where you can say, what, we can emulate these certain kinds of behaviors, but these ones are off limits, right? So like you mentioned how this entire field is so multidisciplinary, right? There's people working on all different kinds of components, from the analysis of the environment to the actual perception to then deciding what to do, then how to do it, all these different things. Do you have any experience with how much you think we can actually achieve without just infinitely more advanced forms of artificial intelligence technology?
Yeah. So I think that actually it may become shocking, but we don't have super heavy implementation of deep learning, machine learning on social robots as much as you see in other areas or fields. And the reason why, because as you mentioned, we're still trying to understand it. There's something nice that we each time we kind of get to say that the more we dive into social robotics, the more we start learning about humans, because a lot of what we do is actually we take what we see, how humans naturally interact with other humans, and we try to implement that on robots, whether we're talking about how we subtle gestures that we do that have a function or a certain understanding. But something to keep in mind is that for me, the first one is that we're still trying to understand how humans naturally interact between each other, and what does it mean to translate that into a robot. Second, we're also dealing with hardware. So social robots also, they have a hardware which also limits us a lot, because it depends on the camera you have, the lidar you have, the audio, the microphone, the noise. A lot of times, you kind of advance in one thing and then you find yourself talking to a social robot, but not necessarily it's understanding what you said. So there's still a long way to go in trying to combine everything for it to kind of make sense, but at the same time, deal with the limitations that you have. Last point I will, because I don't want to take up too much time, but last thing we always say, especially if you look at the literature, virtual agents, they're way ahead of social robots, because they don't have the hardware. So what has been done with virtual agents, they've been like way ahead of us, and we're just like trying to get inspiration as well and trying to implement it, because it's just easier to do things when you don't have the hardware limitation as well.
Right. I feel like there's so much that's hard to implement just because we don't even understand ourselves properly. Because the way that I like to describe machine learning, for example, is quite simply, if we wanted to build a mathematical system, so a computer system that could, for example, take an image and say here's a cat or here's a dog, right? Mathematically, that's very difficult for us to do, because we can't just describe the way that our brains do it. Like we can't tap into that little subconscious portion of our mind and just write out the mathematical function, right? That's not a thing we can do. And so we say, okay, you know what? We know what task we're trying to accomplish. Let's write a mathematical function to automatically optimize for us and figure it out. But then you start dealing with sort of social interaction, and then we start to realize that there's so many just innate behaviors that first we need to understand before we can even start to try and simulate, right? With machine learning and these sort of like simple virtual agent tasks, at least we understand what we're trying to accomplish. It's how to accomplish it that we still got to figure out. With social robotics, there's that whole other layer of abstraction that just makes things so much more difficult. So I love what you're saying. We're learning more about ourselves by doing this. As a matter of fact, speaking of learning more about ourselves and the way that we think, Minarose, now I'd love to know a little bit more about the work that you do as well. I mean, I know we dove in head first with that first question from Rodrika, but now I'd love to know for a little bit more from you on the computational neuroscience work that you do. Maybe to start off, you could help everybody understand a little bit more about what computational neuroscience is. I mean, I'm sure everybody here is familiar with tech and familiar, at least surface level, what neuroscience is, but where do those two meet?
Yeah, and so it basically ties back to what you were saying. Computational neuroscience is using mathematical tools to attempt to model how the electrical and chemical signals in the brain represent the process, our information processing way, and it explains the biophysics behind the calculations that our brain does and the neurons does. All of our actions are our brain computes everything. It does math, and those are the mathematical functions that we are trying to model and drive, and that's what computational neuroscience. The basis of it is forming these models of simulating how learning happens, or in the neural circuitry in the brain using mathematical tools and functions. And so the way I see it is that the computational neuroscience interacts with data analysis, machine learning, all together. They all drive one another. Like, for example, in neuroinformatics, you use data analysis, artificial intelligence, computational modeling to reveal the patterns and connections between our behavior and areas in the brain. And machine learning interacts with computational neuroscience because the deep learning model is inspired by the brain's architecture and how the brain calculates the learning model of the brain. And so one thing drives one another, and they all interact. And so that's the way I see where computational neuroscience fits. And they form the basis of neurotech, and and so for, I guess, my work experience, I started out with working in neuroinformatics, and I had no idea what the field of neuroinformatics was. And it's analyzing huge data sets using, as I said, artificial intelligence and computational modeling to make connections, draw connections from these huge data sets. And then from there, and when I worked in neuroinformatics, I worked using a toolkit called FOOF, which basically, so the power spectrum is very complicated. It has a lot of features to it. And so sometimes the features in the power spectrum confound one another. And sometimes you can't really say that the change in the brain frequency that you observed was actually task related or not. And so this toolkit was meant to separate those parameters. And my job was to use the Human Connectome Project database and parameterize it and see if there was any correlations with or task related changes. And then from there, I guess I went to machine learning, because as I said, machine learning, you can use it to automate. Actually, I didn't say that, but machine learning, you can automate the neuroinformatic process, making it automated data analysis process, or make it faster, or for larger data sets. And so when I went into machine learning, I had to learn everything from scratch. I had no background information in it. And in there, I started working on designing a model that reconstructs EEG, neuroimaging data like EEG and fMRI. And so the point of that is to get the model, well, first we want it to accurately reconstruct one neuroimaging type using the autoencoder model, which the design of the autoencoder has the decoder and the encoder. So its job is to take the information, form the
lattice space, yeah.
Yes, yeah, and reconstruct it based on what it had formed. And so if we were able to get the model to reconstruct neuroimaging properly, then you can find a mapping between EEG and fMRI, and then try to get it to reconstruct different neuroimaging types from one another. And so the applications of that in health and research are vast.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, this is such, complex technology. There have been many times where I'll, like, for example, be doing like a workshop, right, for like a school or university, and I'll have to describe something like, say, like upsampling layers for convolutional networks. And at times, you'll have to take a step back and be like, okay, how do I even explain this? How do I take these concepts and how do you even, explain something like this, especially when it's, on the spot. So no, that makes complete sense. Thank you for sharing. And actually, something that you mentioned that is of particular interest to me is the fact that you didn't have a background in machine learning before you actually delved into it. And so I'm sure everybody on the stream is wondering, since this is a question we get all the time, before you started, you knew you wanted to get into machine learning and use it for this project. How did you go about learning, the different tool sets, or actually diving into the world of machine learning in the first place? What was that process like for you?
Yeah, so because basically I started with just knowing Python language, and then when I did the research project in neuroinformatics, that kind of gave me a little bit more familiarity with how to use libraries and statistical analysis and visualizing neuroimaging data. But then when I jumped into machine learning, the research supervisors were like, "You are about to jump into a deep end. Are you ready?" And I'm like, "Sure, let's." How bad can it be? Basically, I started with had to learn obviously you have to pre-process the data before you can use it, what you feed into the model. So I started learning that, and then I started just learning how to create a simple neural network using tutorials that were online, and getting myself familiar with deep learning specifically, which is using multiple layers of neural networks to get the model to learn by itself through its own error. And so the way that I learned most from being on the spot and under pressure of having to understand everything while learning. And so to progress with the project, I had to learn. And so it was this pressure that kind of forced me to move forward with it. And just continue. Also, like, my research supervisors mentors help so much. Like I recommend gaining experience under someone who can teach you, because they will guide you in the direction. And so my experience was very specific to machine learning in neuroimaging for reconstruction. And so I was learning something very specific. I didn't really, I would describe it as learning it from the inside out. And so if you were, before learning what machine learning and everything is, I learned, okay, reconstructing neuroimaging using autoencoders. And so diving right in and learning things as I went along is how I went about it.
Right. Yeah. Go ahead.
I just wanted to add something that I totally relate to her experience. I think that especially in machine learning, as the field is growing, so I didn't come necessarily from a background where I use machine learning a lot, but you have to dive in and then learn. But there's also something that I think I hear a lot. The field is really big and it's continuously growing. There's so much to learn, and many times you feel like the imposter syndrome kind of in a way, because you're always like, what if I don't know other stuff? We talk about, variational autoencoders, but there are other types, and there are other, and you feel like, maybe I don't know all of this, and it's okay. Like, what I want to say is that no one knows everything. People know something peculiar in the field, and especially I think that now, because it's so trendy to say, oh, ML, AI, throw it in there, and then you think that everyone's an expert. I just want to point out and say that not everyone, there are of course experts, but do not, think that you cannot do it. You can, and it's okay to feel like I'm an imposter, because I think we all feel it, because we're always in a comfort zone inside machine learning, and then we feel like, oh, if I move a bit away from it, then I look stupid, or etc. Don't worry, we're all here learning. The field is growing, so we're all just in this together, learning. as Minarose said, we're diving in and exploring. So
yeah, and I love how you said comfort, because the more I go into this, I realize it's just about getting more comfortable with knowing you don't know this. The more comfortable you are, the faster you can go about learning it. And the imposter syndrome, oh my God. And I remember I went to Brain Hack when my first experience, when I joined the KCNI lab for neuroinformatics. Everyone was doing such different works, genetics, and everyone, like it's a brain hacking site, so everyone's working on projects together, and I'm just like, what am I doing here? Like, how? But it was also a glimpse that, all of this is something you can get to, you can learn, and yeah.
I mean, Dunning-Kruger back at it again. It's yeah, no, that makes complete sense, right? The more you learn about something, one of the things you learn is that you don't know everything, right? Is that there is just so much more to learn. I remember back when I was, a relative kid, I guess, working with tech, back when I was like 10 or 11, I was like, programming is relatively simple, there's not that much to it, right? And I've mostly got the hang of, these different languages, and slowly the more that I learned, eventually learning more compiled languages, how compilers work, and getting into sort of the lower level of technology, the more you realize there's just a whole universe of technology that you can never really know everything about, right? And that's in a way really interesting, because now you have so much more to learn about, but in a way it's also like, okay, how do you begin to grasp something that large, right? So absolutely, that's definitely something to deal with. And of course, if anybody has any more questions about that, feel free to go ahead and ask us in the live stream chat. And on top of that, actually, another thing is that technology is also constantly evolving, right? It's not even just one big static thing. Every day there's something new, especially within AI, right? Like you mentioned how machine learning, artificial intelligence, that's just so trendy to throw around these days. But then again, if you think about it, really though, within the world of AI, because it is relatively new, it's growing really, really quickly, right? Like we're seeing, I think just yesterday actually, there was a paper that I saw called "Attention is Not All You Need," where I think Google and EPFL researchers were like, there's a lot of bias in self-attention layers, right? And so there's so much stuff, and it's like up until now we were like Transformers are the greatest thing to exist, and now we're like, are we sure about that? So there's just so much to think about every single day. I remember quite literally last night at like 2 a.m. I was like, oh, that's a really interesting paper. I should read that before I realized I should probably get to bed. So
Yeah.
Go ahead.
It's really evolving. It really is, great, huge, and it's growing, like it's a field where, as you said, there's so much to do, so much constantly happening, and it's still not very well defined, it's like, it's a bit of everything, and but yeah.
Yeah, it's always constantly moving. That's the thing. Right, and now actually, another really interesting sort of rabbit hole I want to go down right now, and this is about artificial intelligence. And a question that I get a lot, and practically from everybody, is, is artificial general intelligence a thing, right? Is it possible, right? This is a question that has been consistently on everybody's mind for many years now. And I feel like what my opinion has always been, right, and this is something I want to hear your thoughts on too, is that machine learning technology today in its current form, in its current incarnation, which is what powers a lot of AI, right? Machine learning is what powers a lot of AI, is literally just mathematical function optimization, right? It's just mapping X to Y.
Yeah.
And that doesn't result in true intelligence. Rather, it's helping us achieve certain tasks. It's fundamentally narrow, right? Even if we train like a multitask BERT that does lots of different things at once, it's still a narrow system, right? It's not truly intelligent. And one of the things that I've always believed is that we can't just simulate the brain, right? And of course, I'm no neuroscientist, but we can't just simulate the brain by having high-level representations of different components and connecting them together mathematically, because the brain works in a more complex way than that. Things are more intrinsically tied to each other than we might at first glance think they are. There's not just like a dedicated, here's the visual cortex, that's the only thing that deals with vision whatsoever, right? It's not an isolated component. it is still fundamentally tied with hundreds of millions of neurons to other parts of the brain that might also be very important in understanding what the visual cortex is perceiving, or vice versa, right? There can be things that are really tied together. So maybe we can actually start off with Minarose. I'd love to hear from you. What are your thoughts on, first of all, from your experience at least, where do you think we lie on that spectrum, right? With artificial intelligence, do you think to simulate, human-like intelligence, it's sufficient to abstract away details of individual neurons and individual interactions and to take a look at high-level components and simulate them individually? Or do you think to really get that kind of intelligence within computers, we would need to take a step back from our current machine learning and say, okay, how can we actually simulate the little details, what's actually happening in the brain?
I think it's just like you said, I think first we have to know and understand there's so much about the brain itself that we don't know exactly how it connects with everything, how certain parts of the brain connect, how they think we have plasticity works, that's they evolve, the brain evolves constantly, and that's how you are able to process more and better information. And so taking a step back and seeing understanding how the brain actually connects, how those individual components connect before trying to simulate them, I think is very important. But obviously both are evolving both fields are evolving at the same time. And so trying to match what we know with what we're trying to simulate at the same time. I guess where we are is with what is at the same point as what we know about how the brain connects and how intelligence works. It's neuroscience and studying the brain is a whole unknown realm that is yet to be, has a lot to be explored, yeah.
And I can imagine it's particularly hard to do research because of just even ethical considerations where, it's not like machine learning where we can just, rip open the linear algebra that we're using and be like, all right, what do we want to change, right? We can't just open people up and do things like that, right? So it's particularly hard to do research in a field like this that deals with people in the first place. But actually, before we continue, I do want to take up a couple of questions from the live stream chat. First of all, I see a question from Selam asking, can you please give us some suggestions for learning artificial intelligence technology? I see a couple of different suggestions in the live stream chat. For example, Zeus is talking about deep learning AI. Deeplearning.ai, I believe, is a website for learning about our AI technology, Coursera, and so on. But what I'd love to do is actually hear from the two of you as well, different resources or techniques you think are good for people to get into the world of AI. Really quickly, I think my sort of standard recommendations for how you learn artificial intelligence technology is, first off, I would say a great place to start off is making sure, first of all, you're good on the programming end of things. Actually, before I continue, quick break, want to ask you a fun question. Minarose, I know you code in Python. Karen, what languages do you code in?
Java and Python.
Java, Python. Minarose, do you code in any other languages but Python?
No.
No, not yet?
Yeah, but I did used to work. It's actually funny that the first language I learned was Java, so I may be still biased, and this is why I switched to Kotlin. But a lot of the projects that I did work on were on C++. So during my master's, I did work. All of the projects I had were on C++, because I was using ROS, which is the Robotic Operating System, which is an open source operating system for anyone who wants to get into robotics. Highly advise you start learning ROS. It has a great tutorial. So anyways, because of those projects, I was just using C++, and I was working a lot on them because I was building the robots from scratch. And so when you do that, C++ is the best language to kind of
I'm sure.
be able to connect your sensors, etc.
Yeah.
But now I've moved more to Java and Python.
Got it. Yeah, no, that makes complete sense. As a matter of fact, if anybody wants to learn more about ROS and the robot operating system, we have an episode from a couple of weeks ago with Joe Speed, Field CTO at AdLink Technologies, so feel free to check that out. I will link that in the description. But also, getting back to the point, actually, when you mentioned Java, I was literally going to ask, why not Kotlin? But
no, I get asked that question all the time because I'm always when I'm talking to my colleague, because Pepper is the robot that we work on, and so the latest version, it's an Android. And so when we want to deploy it fully as an application, it has to be, in either Java or Kotlin. And I think like among the team, I might be the only one still sticking to Java,
Wow.
But everyone else around me is like, I ask a question to my colleague and they're like, Karen, just switch to Kotlin already. But I'm getting the hang of it. So I wouldn't mind switching to Kotlin. It's just that I think it's just force of habit, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, one of my friends was actually asking me the other day, if you don't like Java, why does anybody use Java? And really, my answer was, it's legacy. It's like enterprise with millions of lines of code that don't want to switch. But some people, you're allowed to prefer Java. I understand. If that is what you like, that's fine. But yeah, getting back to what I was talking about, before you get into machine learning, I would say it is really important to be good on the actual engineering end of things in terms of programming. So when you're getting into the world of AI and machine learning, remember that machine learning is the algorithm, right? AI is what you're trying to implement. In order to implement it, you need to know how to code and know how to actually, implement those sorts of complex systems. And so I would recommend starting off learning how to code. You could use, for example, resources like my book, Hello Swift, or Tanmay Teaches Julia, or CognitiveClass.ai is a wonderful course website where you can do this. And then from there, you can get into the world of actual machine learning and artificial intelligence technology through, again, a resource like CognitiveClass.ai, or I have a bunch of YouTube tutorials as well on getting into the world of AI called Learn Deep Learning from Scratch. And so feel free to please check out those resources. There's also a couple more in the live stream chat that Zeus has put in. Thank you for that. And also, I'd love to know from the two of you, what do you think are some great resources to get into the world of AI? Maybe ones that you've used before or seen online?
Yeah, I wanna comment just to build on what you said, that it's very true. You need to learn how to, code. And I think that also the best way to do that is try to have a fun project for yourself. Say like, I want to build a game, or something simple. Like I've seen people build poker bots, or a video, like a mobile game, or like anything you're interested in. For me, it was robots. I love that. There's a lot of sets out there, but it's as you prefer. And so I think that it's nice to have that because it kind of makes you motivated. First, you get to practice how to code because you're building the actual application, and then you kind of are like, okay, I want to add a source of intelligence to it. So you can, there are a lot of sources out there. There are great courses that are free online, especially by DeepMind as well. And then you can kind of, based on that, get inspired and build something that's fun, especially when you're starting. It's really important to do that because if you see it as your personal project, then it motivates you as well. And
yeah, I totally agree with the application. The fact that you know what the end result will be will help you get past the struggle of trying to understand and implementing it. And definitely applying it the way I did was trying to get experience working with it under someone, a mentor. And in terms of resources, I'm taking a machine learning course right now, and they're using the Machine Learning Refined textbook, and it goes through it really, really nicely. And it also explains the math too, which I was struggling with personally. So it was a nice intersection of both.
Very nice. Yeah, thank you very much for sharing. And I completely agree. Right? It's the best way to learn, especially with something like programming, is to have that sort of, I want to build X and then work towards doing that thing. And personally, I have lots of different, times where I can point to times that I've done that. So for example, like 2 years ago when I was wanting to learn more about, optimizing code and getting to the lower level of different languages and getting things to be really, really fast, I actually gave myself a challenge. Can I write the world's fastest 2048 bot? So can I write a bot that plays 2048 extremely fast? And I actually went ahead and did it. My first iteration was like, it was pretty fast. It was 60 moves per second. Nothing too great, but it could play 2048 and win in like 5 seconds. And it could do that consistently more than 98% of the time. And 2048 in particular is hard because it's stochastic. That is the most annoying part, because you would assume you would get 2s all the time because that's a 90% chance, but the one time you get a 4 generation messes you up. Anyway, that's another whole topic. But what I can say is that I revisited it a few weeks later, and I really, decided to apply some of the new optimization techniques I had learned, and I got it to 1200 moves a second. And the new technique is adjustable. So you can say, you know what, I'm okay with, instead of a 98% win rate, we can go 91%, and you can get like 4,400 moves a second. So in a fraction of a second, it's already won like 100 games. So it's all about these sort of like random tasks that you give yourself, saying, you know what, I'm passionate about code and I like the 2048 game. I'm gonna build a bot that plays 2048 and it's gonna be the world's fastest, right? So can you do things like this, right? I think that is a great way to learn. So go ahead and use those resources as I mentioned, different books, cognitive class. I'll put all those links in the description. But what's most important at the end of the day, you heard it here, is actually go ahead and build some projects, do some things, because that is what you're going to learn from most. And I feel like there's so much stuff in the technology world that you can't even just learn from just a course, right? There's so much that you just get from experience. For example, and this is a relatively small example, but I think it really gets across the point. A little while ago, I was building an application where, surprisingly for the first time, I had to copy some data from memory in C, from a memory buffer from one location to another, but within the same buffer. So I had to like do an overlapping transfer. And you would think you could use memcopy for that. So just memcpy, which is just, standard POSIX function. But actually you can't, according to the spec. You have to use memmove. And I never knew that before I started doing that, right? And that seems like a relatively just random thing to just know, especially if you haven't actually read the spec. And so, if I hadn't caught myself there and actually thought, can you actually copy to an overlapping buffer using memcopy? I never would have figured that out. That could have caused instability. Adobe had that same bug, and that caused multiple products to be unstable when the Linux kernel updated, right? So there's all these random things that you really just learn from experience.
That reminds me of something. Whenever I encounter stuff like that, I actually have I'm a bit old school, but I have like a coding diary.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah, I love writing everything down. So I even have copybooks that are just like when I'm doing a project or things that I stumble upon or that I discover, I love writing them down, even the syntax, and it's just for me. And sometimes I move on to a different language, and then I have to come back and I'm trying to remember something, and I like to check on what I've done. And if you are like that, and if you feel like you need to have that, it really helped me a lot, because it's something for you to go back to, because a lot of times you will switch languages and it's nice to have a track of things you stumble upon.
That's actually a great idea. That's actually a really interesting little sort of thing you do with the coding diary. And the reason that makes so much sense to me is because there have been so many times where I'll pick up like a language or a toolkit and I'll drop it for like 2 years and come back later and be like, oh, I need this again. Time to learn it again. And of course, the second time around, it's easier because you'll be like, oh yeah, that's how you do this random thing in this language. But if you just have your own diary, that helps out so much, right? So definitely do that. Actually, perfect example is like 2 years ago, I was comparing the speed of Kotlin and Swift. And so I had built a big number library in Swift to calculate really large factorials, and I did the same in Kotlin, just see which one I could optimize to get faster. So I had to learn quite a bit of Kotlin to do that. But then I didn't touch it for the next 1.5 years. And now I've forgotten Kotlin, and quite literally 3 days ago, I was building an application. Unfortunately, it was an application where I had to write a lot of Java code, which I am not particularly fond of. And so I was like, maybe I could pull out Kotlin for this, but then I realized I didn't remember much Kotlin. So I sort of met myself in the middle here, and I created a little Java interface that starts a socket, which I talk to from Swift. And then I have my Swift code interact with the Java application through a socket. So, I kind of cheated my way around that one. So keep a coding diary, everybody.
Yeah, the coding diary, I only use one language, but I usually have a Word document that's open, and I keep up with my thought process while doing, okay, so this is what I did. So, because for me, at least, especially I'm just starting in this, I would come back to it a week later and have to go through the entire thing just to remember exactly what I did. And so having that thought process already written down, oh, this is where I stopped. Okay. So yeah, I've been told to, it's very helpful.
Yeah, absolutely. Right. So now what I'd love to do is go ahead and answer a question from Shiva. I think this one's really interesting. This one's for you, Minarose. Shiva's asking, what patterns have you recognized as common between knowing about neuroscience and deep learning? So, this can be from multiple angles. It can be from the actual implementation to as you've learned about it, what are the parallels you've seen? But that's actually a really interesting question. What sort of parallels have you seen between the world of neuroscience and deep learning?
So I guess it's in the circuitry, the brain circuitry. That's the most common parallel that I've seen, in that our brain also has, so the neural network works in a feed forward kind of back propagation. That's how it penalizes itself. That's how it feeds the data into it. And our brain modulates the signals or the stimulus that we receive the same way. I mean, obviously it's inspired by it. And so when you receive a signal, the circuit would process that and translate it. And then it interacts with other neurons to, so if you want, if you were to think back propagation, it is an actual biological phenomena. And so the other neuron would modulate how much of that signal you want to pass on. And in deep learning and in layers, you have layers taking different interpretations of the data. And that's how you come to this Latin representation in the middle, combining all of these different representations. And in the brain circuitry, you have bandpass filters as well. You have the neuron will filter whether you want the low signals or pass only the low signals or the high signals. And so these are all parallels that studying neural circuitry and working with deep learning have helped me see.
Wow, that must be really fascinating to actually work on, because me being more in the deep learning space of things, I hear about all different kinds of here's how deep learning is parallel to the actual brain and different brain circuitry, but it's kind of hard to relate to because I'm mostly just on the deep learning end, right? I don't know all the details of how the brain works and stuff, and I'm not saying anybody really knows all those details, but what I am saying is that you're more familiar with that, so it must be really fascinating to see those parallels and be like, oh, I know that from neuroscience, right? And being able to relate that way. So that must be definitely very fascinating. But at the same time, something that I've personally believed, and tell me what you think about this, is that machine learning technology, while from a very high level, maybe from a structure perspective, it might be loosely inspired by the way that brains are structured, right? Or how they work on a high level. I feel like when you start digging into the actual details, you start to notice that they are more dissimilar than they actually are similar, right? From a lower level. Would you agree with that? Would you say that they're completely different apart from that actual sort of high level structure and maybe the emergent behavior of, once they're trained, how they seem to behave?
No, yeah, that's really interesting. And yeah, they're definitely, the more you go into it, you realize how dissimilar they are. But I actually personally don't exactly know what the differences are. And so I can't fully speak on that.
Right. Okay. Yeah. No. That makes complete sense. Right. It takes a lot of time to start to actually get experience working with these different technologies like at the low level. So no, that makes complete sense. As a matter of fact, actually, another question from Shiva. This one's for you, Karen. What are your views on the future of humanoid robots and opportunities in deep learning based advanced fields 6 years from now? So. I guess we'll abstract that to just in the future generally, but Shiv is asking 6 years from now, how do you see the opportunities of humanoid robots and deep learning sort of intersecting?
I think there are many applications in which they do already intersect, especially if you're focusing more on computer vision, perception, natural language processing. So I think on that side, there is already a lot of intersection. But I think that as we're moving forward, I think, humanoid or social, I prefer social robots. So social robots, you will see them more increasing their presence, and they might take different forms because the way we interact with technology today is quite special. Like we even look at the Roomba, which was, it has a specific use case for vacuum, for cleaning. But then what they noticed was that they wanted to interact with the robot, for example. And so it became more interactive. And what I'm trying to say is that I think that today we may not necessarily be moving towards completely humanoid robots, but we also might be seeing different designs of social robots, because I think humanizing technology is the next movement, because we want technology to be, accustomed to us humans. And so I see the field progressing, especially if we're improving the hardware as we go along, especially to understand, because deep learning requires computational power. And at the moment, unfortunately, we don't really have that. A lot of times there are deep learning applications for social robots, but then when you play it out, it's actually pretty slow because of that. And so if we have, better hardware, we might be seeing more deep learning implementations as well. But in general, I see the field, growing, and I think it will come in surprisingly different forms, and there might be different applications as we go along.
Right. I mean, I love the Roomba example, honestly, because literally a few days ago, actually technically 2, 3 weeks ago, I was recording, so I had a pre-recorded keynote, and I was recording the keynote, and it was about artificial intelligence technology and, risks and the power of it and things like this. And I was talking about how we treat, AI as human-like. And one of my examples was the Roomba. So I actually got a Roomba to be able to demonstrate to people, how people, treat these things as social. I'm hesitating from saying beings, but that's the what
Social
we treat them
agents.
as. Social
Yeah,
agents, right, actually, yeah. And yeah, after I sort of got the Roomba to do the demonstration, after I got it, I decided, it actually is pretty useful. I should keep this. So these sorts of things, they're really fascinating to look at, even just from a human psychology perspective of how do we treat these technologies, right? How do we think of them? I think that's where the real sort of fascinating part really shows up, and I feel like that also is the root of a lot of the bias that we have for AI as well. I think, how people are like, AI is going to take over the world, or it's going to replace all of our jobs. I have a feeling that a lot of these sorts of misconceptions are built because of the fact that we view AI as incredibly human-like, maybe more than it actually is, and also a lot more capable than it is. What do you think?
I think that I'm happy you brought it up. Like, it's a topic we get to discuss quite often, especially if you work, in the field. You get asked that all the time. I think that when it comes to robotics, actually, we talk a lot about the fact that people, because of sci-fi movies or the medias, or just like how's it going, the expectation bar is like, if I say this high, we're kind of not even, like, we fall very short of it, because there are a lot of limitations. People see the Boston Dynamics robots and they do the flips, etc. And then you think that, oh, if I can just go and wave at it, it's going to wave back. But that's not necessarily maybe the case, because every use case is very different. Some are very specific to, being social, others, like the Boston Dynamics, other from the Roomba. And then we keep falling short of expectations because the field is still trying to progress and to move forward. But I think that a lot of the fear comes also from a lack of understanding. People want to throw in the world AI or machine learning or robots around a lot. And it's great that we're getting the conversation started, but how much do we really know? And I think that one thing to solve is that the educational system also needs to be starting to prepare future generations for this new industrial wave, if we want to call it. Here in Europe, there's been a lot of work on trying to start bringing in robots in the school curriculums for children, because today it's so important for children to learn how to code from a very early age, to understand what technology is, to understand what is an algorithm, what are these robots, because we need to accordingly have that shift. But I'm happy that people are starting to ask also, this is a second or third point, about bias, because it's good that we're asking these questions as people are more aware, but I hope it does lead to people wanting to learn about it. I think bias really does stem from the data sets that we're using as well. So the data in itself is biased, and so we still have a lot of work in making sure that our data actually covers the wide variety, the wide ranges of gender, race, ethnicities, etc. Because at the moment, a lot of data sets are quite specific to a specific geo region, which isn't necessarily so inclusive. But also there's bias on the other side of, who is designing the algorithm for which use case. So as we bring in more diversity in the tech field, then, we're less to see bias. But these are important questions to ask as well. And so I think that really asking them is important, but also wanting to learn and wanting to listen to the answer is also quite important for us to, there's no really need for fear, because I mean, being scared is good, but as I said, this is not the first, this is not the second, and this is not the third industrial revolution that we've had. As technology progresses throughout our human race, we've seen this change, and we have to learn how to be adaptive accordingly. But I wouldn't say there's a lot of fear there.
Right.
There's not scared of, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, humans, what's so special about us, and what's great about how intelligent we are is the fact that we have abstracted away intelligence enough to be able to communicate in something as complex as natural language, particularly one of the reasons being so that we can learn from our mistakes, right? So that 3,000 years ago, if someone made a mistake and they documented it in writing, to today, we can understand that and we can learn from that, right? That's incredible. The issue is now that humans aren't exactly built to think extremely long term, right? We're much better than other animals that are just immediate short term, right? We can do some long term planning, but kind of like how we can't necessarily fully comprehend or innately grasp something as big as the Milky Way, right? We can't just understand how big it is because it's too big to grasp how big it is, right? For our mere mortal brains, that's not exactly something that we can do. Similarly, right, as you mentioned, this isn't our first rodeo here. This is the fourth industrial revolution, right? So you'd think we'd be used to this by now, but we're not, because every time the roller coaster seems to drop off from a higher point. so I mean, people are always going to be afraid of change. And especially when there's something like artificial intelligence. I was seeing this one super clickbaity news article the other day talking about how Facebook has trained 2 chatbots and they had to shut them down because they were talking to each other in their own language. And the way that they were talking about it was like, Facebook, they detected these 2 chatbots and they quickly, went into action, shut them down, as if they're like actual, the way we talk about AI in like movies, right? But that's not the case at all. They were running a very simple LSTM experiment where they were seeing if they could optimize the vocabulary they were using for 2 agents to trade items with each other. And what do you know? When they optimized the vocabulary changed. That's the entire point.
Yeah, but actually Facebook isn't the first. I don't know if it's the first, but it's not the only one, at least, to try to do that or to dive into it. And they did realize, that the chatbots were able to create a language to communicate. But they're not the first to do that. And I love the fact that you said that sometimes what I say is that, people are scared of, machine learning, etc. But what it boils down to is the math. So I think that it's been there for over 2 decades now. It's not something that new, but it's now that people are starting to get interested with it. But it has been there for a long time. And really, it's just math. And it's really how we've developed that and mature. I think it's fascinating as humans for us to be able to do something like that, to build something this intelligent as well. And that speaks to how much we still have to discover. And it's a tool like any other, but it's also in a way an extension of us as humans. So yeah, it's quite fascinating. It is interesting.
Yeah, I mean, I gotta say, it's definitely very, very fascinating to see. And I was actually seeing on that news article, one of the top comments was something along the lines of, haven't y'all watched Terminator, right? You shouldn't be doing this. And I was just sitting there thinking, no, that's not how it works. Especially as a developer, that's kind of painful to see is people sort of having those misconceptions. But that's just that's just the opportunity that we have to improve the education system to make it so people are more technology savvy, which I want to get to. And speaking of education, I do want to ask Minarose a quick question. This is actually from the live stream from Mohammed Imran asking, can you please recommend any book through which someone can understand how the mind works? So any books on neuroscience that you would recommend? Unfortunately, I don't have one in the Tanmay Teaches series yet. That's, who knows, maybe soon. But
Coming soon, coming soon.
yeah.
Honestly,
Or even in the online courses or any sort of resources for neuroscience or understanding how the mind works.
oh, I can't begin. There's so many. I would straight up start with the neuroscience textbook. Just start with that. It starts from starting from the foundational basis of what the 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 smallest unit of the nervous system, which is a neuron, trying to understand that. And that's how you are able to build a foundation for what neuroscience is, how the nervous system works, and even extend that to deep learning, machine learning, because you use neurons as the terms are inspired by neurons, perceptrons and neurons. And so neuroscience textbook, pretty sure it's called neuroscience. Yeah, that's what I would recommend.
Very nice. Wonderful. I'll go ahead and ask you for the link for that, and I'll put that in the description so that everybody can check out the neuroscience textbook. Do be sure to check that out. As a matter of fact, that's actually kind of funny because even within the world of deep learning, there's that one famous deep learning textbook that everybody goes to and is like, this is where you learn all the math for deep learning technology. So yeah, I'll go ahead and link to that in the description. And also, very interesting question from Shiva before we enter into the world of education really quickly. And this is sort of leads us into it. Shiva's asking, what kind of mindset do you need to have when you're trying to adapt yourself in a new environment, for example, in some sort of business or any kind of change? So any thoughts on that?
This is something sorry, keep going, go ahead.
No, please go ahead.
This is something I'm still working with, and it's emotional resilience. You're going to fail. You're going to you're going to have to struggle, and you can't bring it back upon yourself or make that as you're not good enough for this. You can't do this. You have to keep going, and being comfortable with the fact that you don't know, and that just builds emotional strength. Being able to get over that so that you can move forward. And I think emotional resilience is something, especially in research and working with computation, that I'm personally still working on.
Yeah, I actually just wanted to say, be comfortable being uncomfortable, because for sure, there are a lot of times you're going to have to adapt. It's a learning curve, it really is. There's a lot of time we are stuck in a bubble. Sometimes we have to change that. Sometimes something new happens, or, projects change, etc. And you need to have this confidence to say, I have the skills that it takes to do the job, but also I have the skills that it takes for me to adapt onto the new job. There are a lot, like if you work in technology, a lot of the applications are really, things change a lot. I've seen people who work, on explainable AI for robots, who also work on that same technology for cybersecurity. So the field is quite, big, and be confident with the skills you have, and be comfortable being uncomfortable, and you can do it. Like, it's a learning experience, and plus change can be exciting too, because you don't want to do the same thing forever. So I get excited when there's something new happening. I've, like, especially looking at my path, I was in physics, and then something very theoretical, very math, and then I moved to engineering, and I had to, I was adapting, I was, changing, and I had a lot of things to learn. Then I moved to software, and you got this, you really got this. It's fine. It's a learning experience. And as I said, if you feel the imposter syndrome, something I remind myself all the time, because sometimes I'm like, oh my God, like everyone else is smarter than me. Just think that you're there for a reason, because you got what it takes, and just remind yourself of that.
Absolutely.
And just to add on to that, sorry,
No worries.
that you bring something like the people I've worked with have come from backgrounds so different, all the way from engineering, physics, stats, music, philosophy, psychology, and all working with application and machine learning. And everyone brings something different, a different perspective. And all of those different perspectives is how this field is progressing so fast.
Yeah.
Right,
Sure.
and as a matter of fact, it just goes to show where, even a little while ago, I had a friend who, for example, works at IBM, and that friend is not technical whatsoever, right? Does pretty much no work with programming or technology, works entirely within content writing. And you would think, how would someone like that fit within a technology enterprise like IBM? But then you start to realize there's so much that goes to technology that isn't even just technology. There is documentation writing, there's creating videos with demonstrations, there's writing
User
blog
experience.
posts to tell. Yes, user experience. There's so much stuff that happens with tech that isn't even just technology. In fact, I would say half of technology isn't just writing code, right?
Yeah.
And again, it depends on the field. There can be some like startups where you have very, very little code to write at all, right? And so you'd have a almost no code startup. There might be some where code is, the central thing you do. Maybe you're building brand new compiler infrastructure or something, right? Whatever it is, it really depends, but technology is a lot more than just writing code. So keep that in mind. Keep in mind that you do have experience, right? And there's always more to learn, and there's always more people to learn from. And so that's definitely something to keep in mind. And so hopefully that was helpful, Shiva. All right, now there are a couple more things that I want to get into, and particularly I want to talk a little bit more on education. So we've talked, quite a bit about neuroscience and about social robots. Now I want to sort of abstract that all away and say, okay, you two are students, you have experience within the sort of educational, what we've put together this field, and I want to ask, what have your experiences been within that sort of field? The education system. How has it sort of treated you with what you're passionate about? And actually, even before we get into that, I do want to start off really quick. Fun question for the two of you. When did the two of you realize that you were passionate about technology? Right? When was that something that you picked up on and were like, I want to dive deeper into tech? It might not have been a single moment, like I know it wasn't for me, but generally, how was that for you? So maybe, Minarose, you can start off.
I've been into tech, but not in terms of coding ever since I was little, like media design and stuff like that. That type of tech. But in terms of in the field of coding, kind of coding and robotics and that stuff, for me it was a moment. I was actually watching a movie and I was really inspired by it. And it's funny you mentioned that you shouldn't be scared of what movies interpret as AI, artificial intelligence. But for me, it was Figure 6, Disney, and I was like inspired by just working and problem solving, and I wanted to do that. I wanted to apply that, and that's really from that moment. That's when I decided to look for the research opportunity, and that's when I applied.
Absolutely. I mean, inspiration can even strike in that one moment. So know that. Thank you for sharing. But Karen, you too. When did you realize you were passionate about tech?
I think that there was actually when I was 16, I think we participated in school in a robotics competition, and it was the first like robots that I built. And it was like the sumo competition, I think, and there were other competitions. And there we ended up winning. It was great, but then I didn't necessarily like I loved it, but I was like, I don't know, no one around me wasn't tech, so I didn't really think that there was much of a career there in robotics. Back then the schools, they were more advising you to stick to traditional jobs, and I wasn't, I was very confused when I was 18. So I was like, okay, listen, I love math, I love physics, this is the only thing I love in school. So I was like, okay, I'm gonna do that. I'm gonna do physics. And then when I was in my undergrad, I started taking computer science classes as well. This is how I learned Java, obviously. And then I realized that I wasn't necessarily into too much theoretical stuff, and I wanted to build stuff. And I wanted to build like robots, and I wanted to, I was interested in mechatronics and stuff like that. And I moved to that field as well. And then from there, I was like, oh, there's so much. I love it all, and I was like, this is where I want to be. And to this day, I tell them, like, I am so happy to be an engineer. Like it's a passion of mine. I love my job. Like I wake up and I'm like, yes, I get to do this and that and build stuff. This is so cool, So every time I think people ask me, like, would you advise us to get into tech? I'm like, yes, oh my God, yeah, we're gonna have so much fun. It's gonna be so cool. So it is like, I think for me, I love it because there's something new every day to learn. There's every day you get to build something different. Every day, like you get to see your work, and so yeah.
Absolutely. Right. When you see something in the world where you're like, code could really help us out here. You have the ability to write that code and actually make that thing. I think that's incredible. As long as you can take what you see as a problem, create a solution, and convert that solution to some kind of programmable logic, you can solve the problem, right? And that's just incredible. As a matter of fact, we actually have a comment from Rajan on the live stream saying, for coding, the only requirement is passion, and I completely agree with that. As I can tell from the two of you, right? I can tell you're incredibly passionate about what you do, and that really does show in your work. As a matter of fact, actually, speaking of that passion you have for technology, throughout your lives, through the sort of traditional education system that you've gone through, what would you say your experience has been like, and how do you think it needs to change in order to help students today actually be prepared for the future? Because, as we've talked about, we're going through this next industrial revolution, and, again, you would think it would get easier every time, but apparently it's not, because we're not really changing as fast as we should, in my opinion at least. Because there's going to be entire industries that will exist in the future that we don't even know will exist today, right? So how do you think education needs to change?
I will jump quickly on that. Just a few points. I think that, as humans, when it comes to big change, we're very slow. Changing systems, I think we've seen it firsthand. It's actually very slow, whether political education, and education goes into politics. So it doesn't shock me that it's this slow, But I think that something we need to learn is that, or in my case, don't rely fully on what you learn in school. Don't sit there and think like, okay, whatever I'm learning right now, this is enough. Be curious and go on your own and learn it. If I was just like sitting and waiting for school to teach me everything I need to learn, I probably wouldn't be in the field I am today. There were a lot of things that you have to learn on your own. Even if you do learn a language in school, go build applications, do work in the field, do an internship, build a project, do something. And then anything, you think that, this is not enough. I see people in this field, they have a different skill. Go and learn that skill. And don't wait for just education to give, or your university to give you everything you need. Dig deep, do it on your own. But in general, I think educational system, I think what we're saying now is that technology is being brought into the classroom, which is great. I see that children are learning Scratch, which is so nice, to see like young people also like think about algorithms at an early age, which is great. There are more toy technologies you can learn, whether coding, etc. So I'm really looking forward to actually having this be more integrated in schools. I'm also really looking forward to actually, just like you have subjects like math, English, I'm really looking forward to having also computer science on there as well, become more of one of the important subjects you learn from early on.
Right. I gotta say, I can kind of see why so many people treat coding or programming or technology as this like really exotic, like unicorn subject that's like special or different. I personally think the entire sort of goal of what we should be doing with the education system right now is not only bring computer science into it, but then also normalize it. Don't make it this different thing. You've got your regular language, math, science, whatever. Then you've got coding, right? No, it's just another thing that you've got to learn, or not necessarily got to learn, but that school will introduce you to, so that you can figure out if you're passionate about it and decide to sort of pursue it further. And the reason that I say that is when we treat it as this different thing, that leads to the conceptions of, oh, you've got to be a genius to code, or you've got to, you've got to have this certain specialization. You've got to be really good at math to learn how to code. But I don't think that's true, right? That's coding is something that pretty much anybody can do if you have the passion for it, right? If that's something that you want to do. As a matter of fact, I actually see a question from Ashray asking, or not necessarily asking, or actually question, is our future full of AI, coding, and robotics, and people who don't know coding would be considered, a lower class? I don't think so. I'm going to answer that immediately. That's a no for me. Because if you think about it, the reason that first of all, three of us are on the stream today talking so much about code is because that's a common link, right? This is a bit of sort of selection bias here. All three of us are really passionate about code, so of course we're going to say, learn how to code. That's something that you should do. But overall, I say do what it is you're passionate about. I happen to be passionate about code, so that's what I do. However, the future with artificial intelligence, machine learning, what it's going to do, in my opinion here, it's going to phase out a lot of the people that currently work in fields and industries that act only as the infrastructure for humanity to get things done and don't directly contribute to creative or imaginative tasks.
I want to give a quick example on that. People say jobs are disappearing a lot, but this is maybe not my field. But I want to point out that, for example, content creation has now become an actual field of work, and it has become, whether Instagram, Facebook, TikTok, I don't know, depending on your channel. Even you, Tanmay, you're a content creator today,
Yes.
And so this has become accessible because of technology, because we have platforms today that are accessible to anyone, if they are, if they have the skills and the passion for, and they're good at, can become a content creator. Now the tools that you need, and this has been enabled through technology, that now anyone can, showcase their talent or their passion from anywhere they are in the world. And so I see more creative jobs coming. So I think that, for sure, it's not just tech. Maybe we are, as you said, because we're in the field, so we're saying that, but I see a lot of creativity, people from art. There's a lot of opportunity there for artists, especially now with NFTs as well. It's a great example to show, how certain technologies have also supported other types of artists, content creators, creatives, curious. We've also seen how tech has also had groundbreaking findings for people in genetics, biology, etc., medicine. And so we're seeing, change there as well. So do what you love for sure, but also be adaptive to the environment around you.
And I also like how you also mentioned before this, Karen, you mentioned that there's going to be user experience and also more ethics, jobs related to ethics, and looking into the bias that might come with developing the technology. And you also mentioned, I liked how you said, I get to do this when you were talking about your experience. This is something you get to do. And so it's about whatever you want to do. Are you able to say, oh, I get to do this? And so the more the world gets dominated by technology, it's not just code, it's going to be making it more compatible with our experience as humans and jobs related to that.
Absolutely, right. It's making jobs more suited for humans to take up in the first place, right? Like a little while ago, I had a keynote. Actually, this was 2 years ago. And time flies by. I had a keynote for the Creative Foundation in Winnipeg, and what the key point that I started off with in the beginning was, when you think of creativity, you usually think of someone who might sing or write songs or paint or art. Art is generally what you think of when you think of creativity, but creativity is so much more than that, right? That is what we stereotypically associate with creativity, but even code, right? When you think about, for example, I was working on a project at IBM, and the point of it was to do really fast function call instrumentation. So you could log down like quadrillions of function calls in minutes, and it had to be super super fast. And I spent many weeks with the team architecting the way that platform would work, and that was an incredibly creative task. Like that was just like any other kind of art, in my opinion, trying to figure out what if we had like a thread local buffer containing function hashes containing the enters and the exits, and to detect when we should save the buffer, flush the buffer. What if we had a thread local class instance with a destructor that tells us when the thread is dying, and all these different things that you just gotta figure out how to get all these different pieces to just work together and sort of fit together well, right? That is an art, absolutely. And so when I say that in the future, thanks to AI, thanks to technology, we'll get to move people into creative fields, I don't just mean art. I mean healthcare professionals, I mean educators, I mean coders, I mean, of course, artists, right? All these different people, these are the ones that won't be replaced by AI, right? They're going to be augmented. And so that's where we want to move people in the future, and that's why we want to make the education system capable of enabling people to work in these different domains, right? So that's
And
definitely.
just to bring it back to like, you mentioned that this is like the fourth industrial evolution. This has already happened. Jobs have been replaced before, but what jobs were replaced? People who like pushback riders for carriages, or like now more jobs with car designers, and so like it's happened before, and we've seen how it happened, and so there shouldn't be a fear of being losing anything.
Absolutely. And Aditya Prakash, for example, in the live stream chat says, it's more of a balance game. Some jobs will go, but new jobs will come in, and I completely agree with that. And what's responsible for being the point at which we balance that? It's the education system, right? We have to make sure that in order to keep it balanced and make it so that as jobs go, we have people capable of filling new jobs, we have to make sure they're educated well. So keeping the education system up to date, relevant, and getting people actually ready for the future is very much critical. So that's definitely important. Now I do want to answer a quick question from Peshal. This one's a bit more specific, asking, is it possible to learn React.js, Node.js, MongoDB, HTML, CSS, and just JavaScript in general in a month, and also build a functional web application in that 1 month time frame? That's a pretty involved question. That's a lot to learn in a month. I'm not saying it's not possible, but I will say it will be challenging, and I'll get into why in just a second. But first of all, do either of you have experience with like front-end development by any chance, like building like interfaces and actual applications?
Yeah, I have, but I think that for me, it's like, as you said, there's a lot to learn if you want to look at, in a very broad way. But if you have a very specific, what you want and why you're building it. So if you have that pretty specific and you know what your use case is, you know how you want it to look like, then, you might be able to do it in 1 month. But if you just want to learn the general, languages of each and become an expert in 1 month, I don't know what time you will sleep, but yeah. But if you have it narrowed down to a specific, I know what I want out of this, and I want to build this to do this, A to B, then you might, be able to pull it off without diving too much into the technical.
That's a very good point, actually, because if you know exactly what you want, you might not even need to learn all those languages.
Yeah.
You could use something like React Studio and just kind of wing it with the coding. That's actually one of my friends, Timothy Duncan. He knows quite a bit of how to code and program. But one of the things he'll do is when he needs to code something, he knows how it needs to turn out. Instead of actually sitting down and saying, "All right, let's open up a new React app," he'll just open up React Studio and code it that way, because then he can focus less on the implementation, more on his logic, which is what he's good at, right? The logic implementing the actual sort of applications. So that sort of really depends on your exact use case. I will say that personally, I have seen way too many people that will get into different programming languages, for example, and sort of understand them from a very high level, and then try to extrapolate knowledge based off of that high level knowledge, but then those extrapolations don't end up working because they don't know it at a lower level. I'll give you a good example, even though this is a bit off topic, but it sort of works, is again, going back to the same thing I was talking about, the mem copy, mem move. My thinking was, there's a memory copy function. It takes buffer from point A, moves it to point B. Simple. So it should work on overlapping memory regions. That was sort of like an extrapolation that I made from the things that I knew. I didn't realize that didn't work, right? Because I didn't understand how memory copy worked at a lower level. I've seen lots of people, for example, that will say, okay, I've learned Node.js. I know how Angular works now. Now I'm going to start learning a little bit of React and try and extrapolate what I know from Angular onto React. Right? I'm going to try and build this sort of declarative interface in the old Angular template-driven manner. And it doesn't end up working because the extrapolations are wrong. So in order to be really good at programming and to be able to get things done efficiently, I think it's worth spending the extra time really understanding the language well before you get into building very complex, like real-world apps. Now, the best way to learn these languages is to build applications. So choose simpler, smaller things to build and test with and gain some experience with. But I would say it's worth the extra time actually, learning the language.
Yeah.
That's what I think. But also, another question, this one once again from Ashray, asking, can an electronics and communication engineer get a job in the automotive industry? I feel like this is a bit more removed from the work that the two of you do, but any thoughts on that?
Yeah. I mean, the simple answer is yes. I've seen it happen a lot. I know a lot of people from either ECE backgrounds or mechanical backgrounds move into automotives because this is the kind of skill you need on there. So again, automotives is a big field. It's kind of a wide field. There's a bit of everything. People work more on design. Others, they work on different aspects of it. So know where you want to fit into that picture and then check the skills you need to get there, but with the background that you have, you probably do have the skills, but dive into it a bit more, understand the different roles in that, and then see what you want and where your skills can fit. But I've seen it happen a lot, so yeah, I mean, it's a good place to start if you want to move into automotives anyways.
Very nice. Thank you for sharing. And actually, as you said that, we got two very, very interesting comments. First of all, one from Rajan saying, in my education, all the time I read for, chemistry, and I've been working in the pharmaceutical industry for the last 13 years. But due to my passion in coding, I have started to learn how to code, which, first of all, I think that is great, right? That's exactly what I'm talking about. Yeah, exactly. Clap for him. Because, coding is the kind of thing where if you're passionate about it, you have the resources to do it. You don't need to, it's not like, quantum mechanics where setting up a simple delayed choice quantum eraser experiment is going to cost you $30,000 and a bunch of optical equipment, right? All you got to do is pop up your computer, even a phone, download a Python interpreter and get coding, right? As long as you have a computer, which almost everybody does, you have the platform on which to learn and the platform on which to build. So you're set, right? And I feel like technology is even making other fields more accessible, like quantum computing enables those kinds of experiments to be run online, but that's a different topic. But still, right, that's exactly what I'm talking about, right? If you're a student, if you're in a completely different field, if you're passionate about tech, you can get into it, which I think is amazing.
Yeah.
And now, a question for the two of you. This one's from Anup Kumar asking, I'm a second-year student. Should I start doing competitive coding or learn machine learning? Before you answer that question specifically, maybe I'm going to hand it off to the two of you. But I do want to ask you first, what are your thoughts on the world of competitive coding to begin with? Because I definitely have a couple opinions on that, but first I want to hear from you. Right? What do you think about the world of competitive coding, if that's something that you've been into?
I don't think I have experience in that.
Yeah, me neither.
Have you ever solved problems on different websites like LeetCode or HackerRank or AlgoExpert or these sorts of websites?
Okay, I see a bit.
Maybe
Yeah,
Project Euler, maybe some of these websites.
I've participated in, like, when I was doing my undergrad, but I don't think I dived too much into it. But I have friends who were a lot in that. I think that, one advantage of competitive coding is that it might be helpful if you want to directly get a job after it, because and a lot of times if you do end up sometimes this is where you find a lot of recruiters. I know a lot of friends who participated in those just to get a job, not just to get a job, but to be exposed to recruiters, and then after that kind of get the job. And it kind of does help you build a lot of skills because it challenges you in a way. So it really depends on what you want. To circle back to the question, it really does depend on what you want. I think as a second year student, if you are into more having stronger skills and focusing only on your skills, then that would be great to dive into, especially if you want to go into a software engineering job directly after you graduate. But if you want to explore also machine learning, and you can also do that. I think it really depends on what you want. Just follow your passion and don't feel like you have to do one or the other. Of course, if you also pick machine learning, don't worry, you're going to be able to work in the industry as well. But I'm just saying, like, based on what I've seen from colleagues and friends, this is why most of them picked also that path.
Right.
But
Go ahead.
no, I just wanted to say, like, no pressure. Really, there's no need to pressure yourself. Like, just go with what you love, and whatever skill you want to build, just build that.
Right. It's really what you're passionate about at the end of the day. I will say that personally, I have taken a look into the world of competitive coding very well. And to describe it, I want to bring up a quote from a technical manager that I know very well. And one of the things he said is that when you have very clean code that doesn't necessarily work very well, but kind of works, it has some value. When you have terrible code that works and gets the job done, it has no value. And the reason for that is because if your code is bad and it works, at the slightest change of requirements, you're going to need to rewrite it from scratch. There's no reusing it.
Yeah.
With good code, you can debug it, you can maintain it, you can upgrade it, you can modularize it. There's these different things you can do to make it better, to make it work. And the thing about competitive coding is, the way that I would describe it is, just because you're an Olympic level swimmer doesn't mean you're a good Navy captain, right? It doesn't necessarily translate. Competitive coding is amazing, and it takes a whole world of skill to do it, right? The people who do competitive coding very well are incredibly talented. However, that doesn't necessarily translate to being a good developer in the real world, building real applications. And the reason for that is simple. It's because taking a very engineered problem, like detect the largest prefix of all the strings in this list, right? Taking a very engineered problem like that and coming up with a very quick and dirty solution to be the first person to actually answer, or to be the fastest of all the solutions. While that is incredibly impressive to be the first, I will say, and while that does take a lot of skill, that doesn't necessarily translate to being great as a developer. So while competitive coding and different websites like LeetCode or HackerRank are great at getting the interview, getting past the interview and being good in the job, I think requires actually, not necessarily just competitive coding, but actually building applications, right? I know a lot of people actually who have this goal of just finishing every problem on LeetCode, and great, that's very nice. It'll help you land the interview, and it'll definitely help you build that logical thinking, but actually building real-world applications, that's not something it's teaching you. So just keep that in mind, right? It's competitive coding and these sorts of solutions aren't just this is exactly how you learn to code. They can definitely help if you use them the right way, and to be completely honest, they can be fun. Sometimes you'll just solve one because it sounds like a fun exercise, but don't misunderstand what they're for, is what I would recommend. So that's what I would think. And now, actually, Karen, question for you. Once again, this is from Shiva. She says, last question from her, asking, what is the top of what's on top of social robotics that we can see in the upcoming future? So, What do you think we're going to be seeing in the near future?
Of social robots. Um, oh wow, there's so much to be done. I see a lot of applications, in the healthcare, a lot also in restaurants. I don't know what they call the field, but more in retail stores as well. So we're seeing a bit more moving towards what we call B2B, so more in businesses and retail. And I think that I hope would be paving the way as well, to finally moving to more B2C, which is more moving into having probably companion robots at home. But it's a transition into the far future. But I think we will be seeing the presence of robots a bit more in our everyday encounters.
Makes complete sense. We're going to start to see more robots. We're seeing more B2B applications. I mean, it's going to be interesting to see what the future of social robots is, but and how people change their perception of these kinds of technologies.
Yeah.
Actually, one thing that I completely forgot about that I wanted to mention is when you were talking about the Boston Dynamics robots, and how they do the flips and stuff, and people are like, oh, so like as you mentioned, if you wave to the robot, it'll wave back. That's not how it works. The way that I would sort of put it is, if you print hello world in Python, that doesn't mean when you say hello, the computer's just going to say hello back, right? You still have to run print hello world. You're telling the computer what to do. It doesn't just implicitly know what to do now. Similarly with the Boston Dynamics robot, they're calling the flip function, or it's more complex than that, but they're doing that manually. What the innovation there is that they've been able to build a hardware capable of doing the flip.
Of doing.
That is incredible. That is just marvel of engineering right there. But they don't have the software to be like, human says do a flip and it does a flip, right? So so that's something to keep in mind.
And I think that that we're moving more towards interactive technology in general. So I think that will the idea of social robots can take form in any different type of product. We're looking today at Alexa, Google Home, Siri, which are also interactive. Add a face to that. If we kind of start moving on to that, building it will be more interactive. I'm seeing more. I mentioned the Roomba. I mentioned in general that we want technology, even if they're mobile technology apps, to be interactive to how we respond. And so we're seeing the trend of personalization and adaptation, but even in video games, which is a big industry as well, which is gaining a lot of momentum, we also see a lot of interactive technology on there. So I think in general it will take different forms, and we'll be seeing it in very different ways as well.
Very nice. Wonderful. Thank you for sharing. And now I would also quickly like to take up, well, not necessarily take up these questions. First of all, I do see one from Anoop saying, "Will Google be replaced in the near future?" I don't think so. I mean, then again, it really depends, because Google is way more than just a search engine now. Right? Google is really Alphabet, I guess, is what you're referring to, which is everything under the Google banner, which I don't think that's being replaced anytime soon. Then again, I guess it really depends, right? So like, for example, Google might have a specific product that gets replaced. Maybe TensorFlow isn't as popular as PyTorch now.
Yeah.
So I think it's individual products and services. You can't make it as broad as to say Google in and of itself, in its entirety, is going to be replaced by another company. I don't think that's going to happen. That's a bit too broad. But there is also another question. I'm a second-year student. I have some basic knowledge of C and C++. What languages or technologies should I learn to get a job at Google? It's my dream to work at Google. Can you please provide a roadmap? I would recommend join us next week. We have a really interesting special guest coming on the show that will help us understand that a little bit more. Can't say just yet, but you'll find out more towards middle of this week. But yeah, any thoughts from the two of you? What are some good ways to practice for the job interview, or to get like internships, for example, from your experience? What would you recommend?
So I think that for Google, knowing C++ is a good start, because I think that they do the interview in like C++, Java, and Go. But I think cracking, if you really want to move more towards software engineering jobs, cracking the coding interview is a great way to start. A lot of practice to do. Practice. I highly do recommend the book. For me, it's been a bit different because it's robotics. So it's not just coding, it's sometimes we're building stuff. There's a lot into it. Like I would say coding takes up 1/3 of my time. It's not something I do all the time because even as a researcher, many times I'm reading, I'm writing, many times I'm just doing data analysis. And so it's a bit of everything for me. So for me, it was more like I was just trying to find internships that I was passionate about and thinking in my head, what am I going to learn from these internships and who am I going to meet in these internships? Because you also want to be in a space that allows you to meet others in the domain and a place where you can build your skills a lot. So I really did put a lot into thoughts into where I was interning and where I was applying for a job, and researching a lot where you want to go to is very important. Preparing for that ahead of time is also very important because recruitment process does take time. So know what you want, really do know what you want, research it and build on that.
Right. And that shows when that shows when you interview and they see that you're truly passionate about it, and it shows, and that's something to take into consideration too, especially the desire to learn and being open to learning new things.
Right. I'm unfortunately forgetting the guest that we had on the show. I believe it was Mike Tibbs as well as Adam Holland, and they were talking about how that one of the key things that they look for when they're hiring is the fact that the people that they're hiring should be passionate. So tying right back into your point, Minarose, when employers see that you're passionate about something and that you're genuinely excited about the work that they do or the work that you do and things like this, that is just all the more incentive for them to hire you, because then that passion then translates into the work that you do, right? So I think that's very important.
Passion cannot be taught. Hard skills can.
Absolutely. Love that. Passion can't be taught. That's exactly it. Wonderful. And also, now I know, Karen, you're a little bit biased. I can understand. You're in France, correct?
Yes.
Okay, so you're a little bit biased, but you're in Europe, so I guess this is the question for you. It's from Akshay asking once again: is Germany a good place for engineers for engineering?
Okay. I'm not in Germany. I'm in France, but I do have a lot of colleagues of mine in Germany who are engineers there. They're quite happy in Germany. Germany is a great place to be as engineers. Like I really, Germany as a country in general is very innovative, and they have a lot of good engineering companies, whether we're talking about, I think Boeing is there. They have Airbus. We're looking at BMW, Mercedes. So in general, they do have really good engineers in the field. It's a great place to also learn. There's a lot of research going on there. Also a lot of applied engineering is going there. I really do respect German engineering, but one thing, if you do want to go to Germany, you need to know that you need to learn how to speak the language. So a lot of what my friends did before going to Germany was that they work in the automotive fields, most of them, and some in robotics, but they did have to learn German before moving to Germany. So they started learning German, I think, a year or 2 years before they moved to Germany, because I think that, I don't know if it's in all companies, but you do need to have a minimum level of German to get in. But because also, I would recommend learning the language to any country you move to. But yeah, Germany is great, if you want to have also, if you want to go there. There's a lot of companies there, yeah. And I think Tesla is also moving. Tesla is at the moment building a headquarter in Germany as well.
Very nice. It's actually very interesting information. I did not know that. So keep that in mind, everybody. Germany is a good place for engineers.
Oh, definitely. Definitely. There's a lot of things happening in Germany. Like really, if you're into automotives, as I said, aviation as well, Germany is a great place to. Even robotics. I think KUKA is also German. So.
Very interesting. Thank you very much for sharing. We will all keep that in mind, and even you being in France, if you're saying that, I'm sure it's great. So wonderful. So I mean, actually, there are a couple more questions, and we're getting so many questions now. I do want to take up a couple more, even though we are getting a little bit towards the end of the stream, but I do want to take up a couple more really quickly. First of all, a comment from Shiva saying, thank you for this episode. It's given me enough confidence to manage my passion and parallelly aiming to do something in the field of medicine. So wonderful, Shiva. Hopefully you're able to pursue both of your passions, and hopefully we've been of help to you. Now there is, I think, a really interesting question from Aditya asking, I'm planning to start my MS in robotics. I plan on targeting the software side. And so how to approach the software side of robotics as a learner aiming for a career in the same. And also, do you as a PhD student feel the need for mechanical and electronics knowledge in your studies and future career prospects? So it's a bit of a sort of heavy question here, but generally, how do you approach the software side of robotics as a learner? And do you feel the need for mechanical and electronics knowledge for your projects and learning? One thing I will say just really quickly before I hand it off to you is there is another really interesting episode of the Field CTO of AD link that I was talking about, Joe Speed. I will link to that in the description because we do talk a lot about how to get into this there as well, and some of the resources you can use. But Karen, I'd love to hear it from you too.
Yeah, thanks. I think that, I come from a mechanical background, and I think it really did prepare me in a way to understand the hardware side of robots, because even if you're working fully on software, you need to understand, the hardware, how it's built, what goes on there, what kind of sensors you have, because that kind of also dictates how much what you can apply and what you can't apply. Mm-hmm. So that kind of did prepare me well, because software goes with hardware when it comes to robotics. But, I moved to software, and now I work full-time on software side. And I think that what really did prepare me was, if you have a good coding background, it's a good place to start. If you're passionate about it, it's also a good place to start. There's a lot of research you can do to go into it. There's a lot happening. So even if you say software, that's not enough. Are you more interested in computer vision? Are you more interested in natural language processing? Are you more interested in navigation? If you are interested in navigation, that's a world of its own as well. Understanding SLAM, the operating system that goes on there. ROS is a great platform to start anywhere you want to do, and so there's a bit of everything. I work more on the human robot interaction, which is similar to kind of human computer interaction. So I work more on the decision making side of the robot. So the field is big. Like, even if you say software, there's a bit of applications everywhere. So know what kind of robots you want to work with, and then accordingly dive in, because even with manufacturing arms, there are people who work on collaborative robotics, explainable AI. There's a bit of everything really in even in the software side of robotics.
Right, and particularly what you said about this being multidisciplinary, that really is something to think about, because, for example, even being on, as you mentioned, the decision-making end of things, being able to understand some of the other technologies like computer vision or like natural language processing gives you an idea of the kind of data you can work with to make decisions, right? So even if you specialize within decision-making, understanding a little bit of everything else is still important. Ties right back into Steve Martinelli in the episode we had just this Wednesday, saying, your skills should be in a T-shape. You should know a little bit about everything and then specialize deep in a couple of things. So having that T-shape is important.
Yeah, and also, like, a lot of projects that I worked on were on drones, actually. So I was more on drone navigation, and but that was also more from, I had to deal, when you're working, for example, in that field, you need a good understanding of also the hardware as much as the software, in order to have like adaptive controllers on there. So it really does depend the application that you have, but it's nice. It's interesting because there's so much to learn. As you were saying, it's really multidisciplinary. Depending on which side of it you're working, you get to be exposed to different challenges.
Absolutely, right. It's all about what again. it ties right back into what you're passionate about and what you want to get deeper into,
Yeah.
right? It really does depend. As a matter of fact, one more question from Anoop Kumar asking, suggest some books or online resources or YouTube channels where you can learn coding and modern technology. We've already covered this a little bit, so feel free to skip a little bit back in the live stream to hear more about the resources that we've mentioned. Just to recap, there's things like, for example, my YouTube channel and books. There's cognitiveclass.ai, which is a great resource to learn how to code and also learn machine learning technology. And so feel free to check those out. Again, links will be in the description. So thank you very much, the two of you, for joining today and giving us all so much insight into the work that both of you do. It's been really fascinating to hear. We've gone all the way from neuroscience to social robots in the world of education and your advice for other students. Answering all kinds of questions from whether Germany is a great place for engineers to what the future of social robotics looks like and so much more. And I know we're edging close on time right now. So what I'd love to do is ask you both, based off of what you've seen from our audience today and the kinds of questions that you've answered, do you have sort of like a closing message to share with everybody? I'd love to maybe start off with you, Minarose. Do you have a closing message to share with everybody before we leave?
Yeah, I guess I'll just say that don't limit yourself based on what your background is. Just get started and go for it. If you're actually passionate about it, then go for it and find the opportunities. The opportunities are there. Find them, go for them, and you'll get started. One thing will lead to another, and you will find your way working towards getting to do what you love. Yeah.
Very nice. When you're passionate about something, right, you find the way to do it. Whether that is using online resources or whatever else it may be, you find a way to do something when you're really excited about it. So thank you very much for that message. And actually, there is one more question I do want to take up from the live chat really quickly before I ask you, Karen, for what you want to leave the audience with today. That's a question from Mohammed Hashir asking, do you need a PhD for research? Great question. Minarose, I know you do some research, and Karen, you're a PhD student, so I don't think there's any better episode to answer that question. Do you need a PhD to do research?
No, but it will help you a lot. So I think that you don't need a PhD to become, to be a researcher. Obviously, if you're passionate about something, you can just go in and become a researcher. But a PhD will help you a lot because if you want to be it teaches you discipline of being a researcher. It teaches you how to communicate your findings. It teaches you, how to work on a project. Like your thesis is your entire project. And so, you work with deadlines, you work with, having a background, the deadlines, writing, etc., publications as well, because it forces you to kind of, put yourself out there, publish, etc., and be seen by the scientific community. I think that you don't need it, but if you really are passionate about research, a PhD is a researcher, a PhD job is to research. So, it kind of falls into that. And also it will help you much better to find a researcher job. I would say, yeah, but you don't need it, but it's a big boost. Yeah.
So it's not necessary, but it can help. And Minarose, what do you think?
Yeah, I was going to say it depends on the level of research that you want to end up doing. And so with a PhD and something a postdoc, you can get to design and come up with the questions and ideas. Whereas if you want to help answer them, and like as a research student, I get to do that and experience answering a question that the postdoc has already come up with. And so that's still doing research. And the more research experience you have, the easier it becomes going into it. So whether you're going to do a PhD or just start doing internships and opportunities, the experience is what the key concept about this.
Right. Applied experience is always the number one thing to keep in mind, right? Whether you can get a PhD, it's going to help you out a lot, but at the end of the day, what the PhD is doing is it's giving you experience, and that experience is what counts, right? So hopefully that was helpful, Mohammed. Again, feel free to, if there are any questions we couldn't get to in the live stream chat, feel free to put them in the comments. We'll definitely try and get back to as many in the comments as we can. And of course, all links will also be in the description. But Karen, now I would love to know from you as well. What would you like to leave the audience with before we go today?
Yeah, the future is exciting, Minarose, you said that passion, which is, we touch on that a lot, which is super true, but also the future is really exciting. There's so much happening, the world is really your oyster. And I think my experience also speaks for itself. Like, I never once had like my path, I wouldn't say is an orthodox path towards, doing what I did today, but I followed what I love. And if there was a skill along the way I had to learn, I needed to sit and learn in order to move forward. And I probably will continue doing that. There's a lot of other positions I want to move to in tech that I will have to learn about. And don't be afraid of learning, don't be afraid of putting yourself out there, don't be afraid of daring, and think in your head what kind of person I want to be in general, and follow that.
Right, it's always about consistently challenging yourself and looking for that next thing to do. I mean, I remember we had Tiago on the show a little while ago. He's an executive at Microsoft, and he was talking about how it's, consistently throughout your career, you should be challenging yourself and seeing what's that next big thing I can do, right? I mean, as you mentioned, Karen, right? Be comfortable being uncomfortable, right? So make it so that you're used to always having new things to do and new things to learn, because that's the only way you're ever going to really advance, not just your career, but just generally throughout your life. Figuring out and learning new things is only going to be done when you're outside of your comfort zone and what you already know. So once again, huge thank you to you, Karen and Minarose, for joining me today. I've loved hearing your insights into the world of education and, of course, the research that you two do in specific. So much fascinating stuff from the world of robotics, which is something, that I've stereotypically actually kind of avoided in the past, because so many people just treat robots as like, the thing that's meant to simulate human intelligence, or, and then from the business perspective, there's just, the thing we put outside our company's like lobby as a glorified chatbot to wave to people as they walk in, right? And it's like, those are both a waste of technology. We need something that's meaningful. So I've really enjoyed hearing that from you, Karen. It's actually seeing these things applied well. It's been so refreshing. So thank you for showing that to me. And of course,
I learned a lot too from that.
Yeah, I learned a lot too, guys.
Thank you. And of course, Minarose, hearing about the work that you're doing with neuroscience and understanding your perspective on, the similarities between deep learning and the brain and so much more has just been so fascinating. And so thank you very much both for sharing, and thank you very much everybody for joining us today. Again, any questions we couldn't get to, feel free to put them in the comments. We'll definitely get to them. And make sure you join us next week. We're going to have some really fascinating discussions. And next week we'll also be coding live too, and doing some really, really fun, technical stuff. So make sure you join us, and you'll be able to hear more about what we're doing on next Sunday towards the middle of this week as well. So thank you very much, everyone, for joining. Thank you, Karen, Minarose, and goodbye, everybody. Bye.
Thanks.